The sky bled crimson, reflected in the dull grey tiles of his village. 10-year-old Elias stood on the rooftop, his eyes fixed on the churning black smoke rising from the east wall. That ravenous beast had consumed his homeland, turning verdant fields to ash, tearing the peaceful sky with the roar of cannons. Elias felt the heat on his face, as though the flames themselves were licking at him, devouring every last shred of hope. He remembered gentler days when the village echoed with the laughter of children, birdsong filling the air. Now only screams, wails, and the thunder of enemy hooves filled the silence. His parents had left last night, joining the desperate tide, flowing towards the battlefield to defend their sliver of the world they'd promised to return. But Elias knew that in this brutal conflict, promises were as fragile as cobwebs in a storm. In Elias's hand rested a small dagger, his father's last gift before leaving. The blade was sharp cold, reflecting the fiery glow. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of his father's courage, his resolve, his love. Elias gripped the dagger, feeling its weight in his palm, as though he held his very fate. He had to be strong for his frail grandmother and his little sister. Lily, they were all he had left from his vantage point. Elias saw dark figures moving in the distance. The enemy clad in black armor, astride massive, fearsome war horses. They destroyed everything in their path, leaving no mercy in their wake. Elias knew that if they were discovered, he and his family wouldn't stand a chance. He had to act quickly, scrambling down his heart, hammered against his ribs. Their small cottage, once filled with laughter, now lay shrouded in an eerie silence. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering inferno in the east. Elias rushed to his grandmother, who sat huddled on a worn wooden stool, clutching Lily close. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes clouded with tears. Lily, just 5 years old, sobbed uncontrollably, her small face pale with terror. "Grandmother, we have to go," Elias said, forcing his voice to remain steady. He knew that if they stayed, they would be found. The enemy was closing in, and they wouldn't spare anyone. Grandmother nodded her lips, trembling. "Go, Elias," she whispered, her voice frail. "Take Lily, I'll follow." Elias knew she was trying to be brave, but she was weak. Her legs trembled, her steps faltered. He helped her up, draped a thin blanket over her shoulders, and lifted Lily into his arms. "Grandmother, you have to be strong," Elias said. "We'll get to safety." They slipped out of the cottage, following a narrow path that led behind the village. Elias scanned his surroundings, his ears straining for any sign of pursuit. He had to be sure they weren't followed. The night was pitch black, the wind whipping around them, carrying the scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Screams, cries, and the clang of metal echoed from the distance, a symphony of death. Elias tightened his grip on the dagger, fear coiling in his stomach. But he couldn't falter. He had to protect his family to get them to safety. They walked for hours, not daring to stop. Grandmother grew weaker with every step, her gait becoming more labored. Lily clung to Elias, her sobs echoing in the night. He tried to comfort her, to reassure her, even though his own heart was filled with fear and uncertainty. "Shh, Lily, don't cry," he murmured, stroking her soft hair. "We're almost there. We're almost safe." But he knew it was a lie. He didn't know where safety was. He just knew he had to keep moving, to keep hoping for a miracle. Along the way, they encountered others fleeing the violence. Their faces mirrored the same despair, the same terror. Some were injured, limping along. Others had lost loved ones, their cries tearing through the night. Elias saw a young woman clutching a baby to her breast, her face a mask of fear. The baby wailed, hungry for milk, but the woman had nothing to give. She just held her child tighter, tears streaming down her face. Elias's heart ached for the woman and her child. He wanted to help them, but he didn't know how. He could only continue his own journey, hoping that they too would find safety. They came across an old man, his beard and hair as white as snow, sitting by the side of the road, his face etched with exhaustion. He was too frail to continue. He simply sat there, waiting for death. Elias approached him, asking after his well-being. The old man explained that the enemy was actively hunting down those who fled and advised them to try to reach the city to the north, which was rumored to be safer. "Thank you," Elias said. "We'll try to get there." Elias knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he couldn't give up. He had to get his grandmother and Lily to safety. He had to give them hope, even if that hope was as fragile as a star in the darkest night. He looked at the faces of his family, their fear a palpable presence in the cold night air. He gripped the dagger tighter, the cold steel a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. He knew he had to be their protector, their guide, their hope. And so, with a deep breath, he led them onward into the unknown. The old man's words echoed in Elias's ears as they continued their journey. The city to the north, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. But the path was treacherous, winding through dense forests and across desolate plains. The once familiar landscape, now scarred by war, felt alien and hostile. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, offered little comfort, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like phantoms amongst the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through Elias. He clutched Lily tighter, his hand never straying far from the dagger at his hip. Grandmother's strength was waning. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her steps increasingly unsteady. Elias often had to support her, his small frame straining under her weight. Lily, exhausted and frightened, whimpered softly in his arms. He whispered soothing words, trying to comfort her, but his own voice trembled with exhaustion and fear. "We'll be there soon, Lily," he murmured, though he had no idea how much further they had to go. "We'll be safe soon." The forest grew darker, the trees looming like menacing giants. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Sounds that once brought Elias comfort now seemed ominous and foreboding. They stumbled upon a small stream, its water gurgling softly over the rocks. Elias gently lowered Lily to the ground and helped grandmother sit down. He knelt by the stream, cupping his hands to drink the cool water, then offered some to Lily and grandmother. It was a small respite, a brief moment of peace in the midst of chaos. As they rested, Elias noticed a faint glow in the distance. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. Could it be a campfire or perhaps a village? Hope flickered in his chest. Maybe they weren't alone. After all, he decided to investigate, telling grandmother and Lily to stay put. He cautiously made his way towards the light. As he drew closer, he realized it was a campfire, nestled in a small clearing. Several figures sat around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Elias hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Were they friend or foe? He decided to take a chance. He stepped into the clearing, his hand instinctively reaching for his dagger. The figures around the fire looked up, their eyes widening in surprise. They were a small group of refugees like Elias and his family, fleeing the war. They welcomed him warmly, offering him food and water. Elias gratefully accepted his stomach, gnawing with hunger. He told them about his journey, about his grandmother and sister. The refugees listened sympathetically, their own stories mirroring his own. They spoke of lost homes, lost loved ones, and the horrors they had witnessed. One of the refugees, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, offered to help Elias and his family. She told him about a hidden path that would lead them around the enemy lines, a path that would take them closer to the city in the north. Elias's heart soared with gratitude. He thanked the woman profusely, his eyes brimming with tears. He returned to grandmother and Lily, his heart filled with renewed hope. He told them about the hidden path, about the kindness of the refugees. Grandmother smiled weakly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "May the gods bless them," she whispered with renewed determination. Elias led his family along the hidden path. It was narrow and overgrown, but it offered them a measure of safety. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The moon had disappeared behind the clouds, plunging the forest into darkness. But Elias didn't falter. He knew that as long as they stayed on this path, they would be one step closer to safety, one step closer to hope. The city to the north, once a distant dream, now felt within reach. And with every step, Elias's resolve grew stronger, fueled by the love for his family and the belief that a better future awaited them. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since the war began, Elias felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. The hidden path, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness, eventually led Elias' grandmother and Lily out of the dense forest and onto a dusty plain. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and dust, clung to their throats. In the distance, the silhouette of the northern city rose against the horizon, its high walls a stark reminder of the conflict that raged beyond. It was a sight that filled Elias with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Hope, because it represented sanctuary, a potential haven from the horrors they had endured. Trepidation, because even from afar, he could sense the tension, the fear that clung to the city like a shroud. As they drew closer, the scale of the siege became apparent. The city walls, once symbols of strength and security, were now scarred and battered, bearing witness to the relentless assault. Catapults hurled massive stones against the fortifications, while archers rained down arrows from siege towers. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the deep rumble of siege engines echoed across the plain. The air was thick with the cries of men, the clash of steel and the screams of the wounded. It was a scene of utter chaos and destruction. Elias's heart sank. The city, their beacon of hope, was trapped in a desperate struggle for survival. He had hoped for sanctuary, for respite, but instead they had stumbled upon another battlefield. He looked at grandmother and Lily, their faces pale and drawn. Grandmother leaned heavily on his shoulder, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Lily, her eyes wide with fear, clung to his hand, her small body trembling. "It's all right, Lily," Elias whispered, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We'll be safe inside the walls." But even as he spoke, the words, he knew they were hollow. Reaching the city was only half the battle. Gaining entry amidst the chaos and violence would be a challenge in itself. They joined the throng of refugees huddled outside the city gates, a desperate mass of humanity seeking shelter from the storm. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, fear and despair. People coughed and spluttered their bodies, weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Children cried their voices, lost in the cacophony of the siege. Elias kept a watchful eye on his surroundings, his hand never straying far from his dagger. He had heard stories of bandits and opportunists preying on the vulnerable in times of chaos, and he was determined to protect his family. The city gates remained firmly shut, guarded by heavily armed soldiers. Every so often, a small group of refugees would be allowed entry, but the process was slow and agonizing. Elias watched as families were separated, loved ones torn apart. Panic gnawed at him. What if he and his family were separated? What if they weren't allowed inside? Hours passed, the sun beating down mercilessly on the huddled masses. Grandmother's condition worsened. She coughed incessantly, her body racked with fever. Lily too was beginning to show signs of exhaustion and dehydration. Elias grew increasingly desperate. He had to do something, anything, to get his family to safety. He noticed a small group of soldiers patrolling along the walls, away from the main gate. An idea, desperate and risky, began to form in his mind. He could try to climb the wall to bypass the gate and find a way inside. It was a dangerous gamble, but he was running out of options. He explained his plan to grandmother. His voice, trembling with a mixture of fear and determination, grandmother, despite her weakened state, nodded her approval. She knew that time was running out. "Be careful, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And may the gods protect you." With a deep breath, Elias handed Lily to grandmother and began to search for a way to scale the wall. He found a section where the stones had crumbled, creating a rough, uneven climb. He looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. The wall seemed impossibly high, the climb daunting. But he couldn't hesitate. He had to try. He began to climb, his small hands gripping the rough stones, his feet searching for purchase. The climb was arduous, his muscles burning with exertion. The sounds of the siege echoed around him, a constant reminder of the danger he faced. But he didn't stop. He climbed higher and higher, driven by the desperate hope of finding safety for his family. He knew that if he fell, it could be the end. But he also knew that if he didn't try, they might not survive. And so, with gritted teeth and trembling hands, he continued to climb, inching his way closer to the top, closer to the shadow of the walls, closer to an uncertain future within the besieged city. Elias finally reached the top of the wall, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, the rough stone digging into his skin. Below him, the siege raged on a chaotic symphony of destruction. Above him, the sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn painting the horizon. He cautiously peered over the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. The city within the walls was a labyrinth of narrow streets and crumbling buildings, shrouded in an eerie silence. It was a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. He had to find a way down, a way to get back to grandmother and Lily. He scanned the wall, searching for a foothold, a rope, anything that could help him descend. Just as despair began to creep in, he spotted a rope ladder dangling from a nearby watchtower. Hope surged through him. It was a risky maneuver, but it was his only chance. He carefully made his way towards the watchtower, clinging to the rough stone, his every move measured and deliberate. He reached the ladder and with a deep breath began to descend. The ladder swayed precariously in the wind, threatening to send him plummeting to the ground below. But he held on tight, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the ground below. He reached the bottom, his legs shaky, his body trembling with exhaustion. He found himself in a small deserted courtyard, surrounded by high walls. He was inside the city, but he was alone. He had to find grandmother and Lily. He set off through the maze of narrow streets, his heart pounding with anxiety. The city was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the siege. He passed deserted houses, their windows shattered, their doors hanging open. He saw signs of the fighting everywhere, overturned carts, scattered debris, and the occasional dark stain on the cobblestones. He called out for grandmother and Lily, his voice echoing through the empty streets. But there was no reply. Fear gnawed at him. What if something had happened to them while he was climbing the wall? What if they had been discovered by the enemy? Just as he was about to give up hope, he heard a faint cough. He followed the sound, his heart pounding with anticipation. He turned a corner and saw them huddled together in a doorway, grandmother wrapped in the thin blanket, Lily asleep in her arms. Relief washed over him, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He rushed towards them, his voice choked with emotion. "Grandmother Lily." Grandmother looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Elias, you made it." He knelt beside them, his arms wrapped around them both. He felt Lily stir in his arms, her small hand reaching out to touch his face. "Elias," she murmured sleepily. "I'm here, Lily." He whispered, his voice thick with tears. "We're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't truly safe. They were inside the city walls, but the siege continued. Food and water were scarce. Disease was rampant, and the threat of the enemy loomed large. They had found temporary refuge, but their journey was far from over. They spent the next few days huddled in the doorway, sharing what little food and water they had left. Elias ventured out into the city, searching for supplies, but everything was scarce. He witnessed the desperation of the besieged citizens, their faces etched with hunger and fear. He saw children begging for food, their bodies thin and frail. He saw the sick and the wounded, their cries echoing through the empty streets. One evening, as he was returning to Grandmother and Lily, he stumbled upon a hidden cellar. He cautiously descended the steps, his hand gripping his dagger. The cellar was dark and damp, but it offered a measure of protection from the elements. He found a few sacks of grain and a small barrel of water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them for a few more days. He returned to Grandmother and Lily, his heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. He told them about the cellar, about the supplies he had found. Grandmother's eyes shone with gratitude. "You are a blessing, Elias," she whispered, "a true blessing." As they settled into their new hiding place, Elias knew that their struggle for survival was far from over. But he also knew that as long as they had each other, as long as they had hope, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The city may be under siege, the world around them may be crumbling, but within the confines of that dark, damp cellar, they had found a small sanctuary, a place where they could cling to the embers of hope and dream of a brighter future. Days bled into weeks within the shadowed confines of the cellar. The siege raged on the rhythmic thud of catapults and the screams of the dying, a constant grim soundtrack to their existence. The meager supplies Elias had found dwindled, and hunger became a gnawing presence, a constant companion to their fear. Grandmother's cough worsened, racking her frail body. Lily, though brave, grew quieter, her usual playful energy replaced by a listless weariness. Elias, despite his own exhaustion and fear, remained their pillar, their protector, their source of hope. He ventured out into the city whenever he dared, scavenging for scraps of food, a few drops of clean water. The city, once vibrant and bustling, was now a ghost of its former self. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were deserted, and the air hung heavy with the stench of death and decay. He witnessed scenes of unimaginable suffering, families torn apart, children orphaned, the sick and wounded, left to die in the streets. Each day the grip of despair tightened its hold on the city. Yet even in the darkest of times, hope flickered. Elias encountered small acts of kindness, glimmers of humanity amidst the brutality. He saw neighbors sharing their meager rations, strangers offering comfort to the grieving, and the wounded helping each other. These small acts of compassion, like embers in the ashes, fueled Elias's determination to survive, to protect his family, to find a way out of this nightmare. One day, while scavenging near the city walls, Elias overheard a conversation between two soldiers. They spoke of a secret tunnel, an escape route used by smugglers to get in and out of the city. Elias's heart leaped with hope. This could be their chance, their way to freedom. He cautiously followed the soldiers, keeping a safe distance, his senses heightened. He watched as they disappeared into a narrow alleyway then into a hidden doorway, concealed beneath a pile of rubble. Elias waited until they were gone. Then, with a deep breath, he approached the doorway. He pushed aside the rubble, revealing a dark, narrow passage. He hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at him. What if it was a trap? What if the tunnel led to a dead end? But he couldn't turn back. He had to try. He called out to Grandmother and Lily, telling them to follow him. Together, they entered the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew. Elias led the way, his hand gripping his dagger, his senses alert to any danger. The tunnel twisted and turned, seemingly going on forever. The silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Grandmother stumbled occasionally, her weakened body struggling to keep up. Lily, her eyes wide with fear, clung to Elias's hand. "Are we there yet?" "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Almost, Lily," he replied, trying to sound reassuring, though he had no idea how much further they had to go. After what seemed like an eternity, they saw a faint light ahead. Hope surged through them. They quickened their pace, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the end of the tunnel. They emerged into a small hidden grove, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. The air was fresh and clean, the scent of pine needles filling their lungs. Birds sang in the trees, their melodies a welcome contrast to the sounds of war they had grown accustomed to. They had escaped. They stood there for a moment, blinking in the sunlight, savoring their newfound freedom. Grandmother sank to her knees, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Lily, her face radiant with joy, ran into the grove, laughing and twirling amongst the trees. Elias watched them, his heart swelling with emotion. They had faced unimaginable hardships, endured unimaginable suffering, but they had survived. They had found their way out of the darkness and into the light. But even as he savored this moment of reprieve, Elias knew that their journey was far from over. They were free from the besieged city, but they were still in enemy territory. They still had to find a way to reach the promised land, a place where they could finally rebuild their lives, a place where they could finally be safe. And so, with renewed determination, Elias gathered his family, and they set off once more into the unknown, their hearts filled with hope, their spirits unbroken. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, as they had always done, a family bound by love and resilience, forever seeking a glimmer of hope in the ashes of war. The escape from the city had been a victory, a testament to their resilience. Yet freedom brought its own set of challenges. The war, though no longer a constant, thunderous presence, still cast a long shadow over the land. The scars of conflict were everywhere. Burned villages, deserted farms, and the lingering scent of smoke in the air. They traveled through a landscape of ghosts, the remnants of a life that had been brutally extinguished. Elias' grandmother and Lily journeyed on, following the whispers of hope that spoke of a sanctuary to the west, a promised land untouched by war. They walked for days, their journey marked by hardship and uncertainty. Food was scarce, often relying on the kindness of strangers, other refugees fleeing the conflict. They slept under the open sky, the stars their only comfort. The constant threat of discovery of encountering enemy patrols kept them on edge. Their senses heightened. Grandmother, weakened by the ordeal of the siege, grew increasingly frail. Her cough persisted, a constant reminder of the toll the war had taken on her. Lily, though still clinging to a childlike resilience, began to exhibit signs of the trauma she had endured. She would often wake up screaming in the night, haunted by nightmares of the siege, of fire and screams. Elias, bearing the weight of responsibility for his family, pushed down his own fear and exhaustion, determined to protect them, to guide them to safety. One evening, as they huddled around a small fire, trying to ward off the chill of the night, Grandmother began to tell stories of their village, of the life they had once known. She spoke of the vibrant marketplace, the bustling streets, the laughter of children playing in the fields. She spoke of their home, a small cottage with a garden filled with fragrant flowers. Her voice, though weak, was filled with a warmth that brought a flicker of light into the darkness. Lily, mesmerized by her grandmother's stories, snuggled closer, her eyes wide with wonder. Elias listened intently, his heart aching with a mixture of nostalgia and grief. He remembered those days, those carefree days of innocence before the war had shattered their world. The memories, once a source of comfort, now felt like a burden, a reminder of everything they had lost. As Grandmother continued her stories, her voice began to falter. She coughed a deep, racking cough that shook her frail body. Elias and Lily exchanged worried glances. They knew that Grandmother was growing weaker, that the journey was taking its toll on her. "Grandmother, you need to rest," Elias said, his voice filled with concern. Grandmother smiled weakly. "Just one more story." "Elias," she whispered, "one more story before I—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes closing. Elias and Lily watched in horror as her body went limp, her breathing shallow. They called out to her, their voices filled with panic, but she didn't respond. Grandmother was gone. The world around Elias seemed to crumble. He had lost his parents, his home, his village, and now his grandmother. He felt a wave of grief wash over him, so profound it threatened to drown him. He clung to Lily, her small body trembling in his arms. He had to be strong for her. He was all she had left. They buried Grandmother beneath a willow tree, its branches weeping over her grave. They had no words to say, no prayers to offer, only tears and silent grief. The fire flickered and died, leaving them alone in the darkness, the silence broken only by the whispering wind and the distant cries of night birds. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on Elias, heavier than ever before. He was just a boy, yet he had to be a man, a protector, a guide. He looked at Lily, her small face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored his own. He knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep going for her, for the memory of his family, for the hope of a better future. He had to carry the weight of their memories, the weight of their loss, and find the strength to continue their journey towards the promised land, towards a new beginning. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but somewhere in the distance, a faint glimmer of hope still flickered. And Elias, with a heavy heart and a newfound resolve, would follow that glimmer, no matter how faint, no matter how far. The loss of Grandmother cast a long shadow over Elias and Lily. The world, already ravaged by war, felt colder, emptier. Yet amidst their grief, a new kind of strength emerged, a quiet resilience born of necessity. Elias, now both brother and parent, carried the weight of their shared loss. The responsibility for Lily's future etched onto his young face. He knew he couldn't afford to succumb to despair. He had to keep moving, keep hoping, keep believing in the promise of a better tomorrow. They continued their journey westward, the landscape slowly changing from scorched earth and ruined villages to rolling hills and verdant valleys. The air, once thick with smoke, now carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. It was a subtle shift, a whisper of renewal, a promise of life returning to the ravaged land. They encountered other refugees along the way, families and individuals, all bearing the scars of war, all searching for a new beginning. Some offered kindness, sharing their meager rations, offering words of comfort and encouragement. Others, hardened by their experiences, were wary, suspicious, their eyes reflecting the darkness they had endured. Elias learned to be cautious, to trust his instincts, to protect Lily from those who might seek to harm them. One day, they stumbled upon a small hidden valley nestled amongst the hills. A clear stream flowed through the valley, its banks lined with lush vegetation. Wildflowers bloomed in vibrant colors, their fragrance filling the air. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary untouched by the ravages of war. Elias and Lily decided to stay for a while to rest and recuperate. They built a small shelter from branches and leaves, a temporary haven from the elements. Elias taught Lily how to fish in the stream, how to identify edible plants, how to survive in the wilderness. They spent their days exploring the valley, discovering hidden waterfalls, ancient trees, and fields of wildflowers. It was a time of healing, a time of rediscovering the simple joys of life. Lily, freed from the constant fear and uncertainty of their journey, began to regain her playful spirit. She would chase butterflies through the fields, splash in the stream, and sing songs she had learned from grandmother. Her laughter, once a rarity, now echoed through the valley, a melody of hope and resilience. Elias, watching, Lily felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. He knew that their journey was far from over, that they still faced an uncertain future. But in this small, hidden valley, they had found a moment of respite, a chance to heal, a chance to remember what it meant to be alive. One evening, as they sat by the fire, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, Elias spoke of the promised land, the place they were searching for. "Do you think it's real, Elias?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Elias looked at her, his heart filled with a quiet conviction. "Yes, Lily," he said. "I believe it is. I believe there's a place out there, a place where we can be safe, a place where we can build a new life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. Inside, nestled amongst the few coins they had left, were a handful of seeds. Seeds he had saved from their garden, back in the village, seeds that represented hope, seeds that represented a new beginning. "These are seeds from our garden, Lily Ordre," he said, holding them out to her, seeds of hope. "When we find the promised land, we'll plant them and we'll watch them grow." Lily took the seeds, her small fingers tracing their contours. She looked at Elias, her eyes shining with a newfound determination. "We will, Elias," she whispered. "We will." And so, with renewed hope and a handful of seeds, they continued their journey westward, towards the rising sun, towards the promised land, towards a future where they could plant those seeds and watch them blossom, a symbol of their resilience, a testament to their enduring spirit. The journey was long, the path uncertain, but they walked hand in hand, brother and sister, bound by love and loss, carrying the weight of their memories and the seeds of hope towards a new beginning, towards a life yet to be written. The war had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken their hope, their spirit, their unwavering belief in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. And in that belief, they found the strength to continue to endure, to survive, and ultimately, to thrive.